Hello everyone, welcome to Cyberscoop TV. Greg Otto, your managing editor here. We're coming to you from the 2017 Black Hat Conference. And I'm talking with Michael Daniel, the president of the Cyber Threat Alliance. Michael, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
So the Cyber Threat Alliance is a relatively new group. Talk to me about what your focus is.
Sure. The Cyber Threat Alliance is a consortium of cybersecurity companies that is focused on sharing cyber threat intelligence at speed, at scale, in a way that's designed to enable everybody to provide better products and services to their clients and customers. And it's also designed to enable us to pool that information in a way that will allow us to better disrupt the adversary over a longer period of time.
So how many companies are involved in the group, and talk about your momentum going forward?
Sure. Right now we have 12 members, and we've added one recently, which is SK InfoSec from South Korea. And then we've got 2 more in the pipeline that have signed the paperwork that we'll be announcing later this fall.
Great. Interested to see how that evolves. Want to talk about something that was something of a focus of yours during your time in the Obama administration, the vulnerabilities equities process. We've seen in the past couple weeks there's been some real momentum on changing the way that has worked. I would love to hear your thoughts on whether that is headed in the right direction in your eyes, or where is it going to move forward in the next 6 months?
Sure. Well, I would say that when you talk about that vulnerabilities equities process, you can definitely make some changes around the edges, but the fundamental principles of the fact that the government is going to have an interest in retaining certain vulnerabilities to conduct its intelligence, national security, law enforcement mission is absolutely critical. And multiple governments are going to do that. But at the same time, you also want a process to ensure that all of the relevant considerations are taken into account so that the benefits of retaining a vulnerability, for example, are weighed against the costs, to the risk to infrastructure, the economic risk, the national security risk itself. And so you want some sort of interagency, whole-of-government process to ensure that all of those factors are taken into account. That's really the core principles of the vulnerabilities equities process. And I think that to the extent that Congress feels that it should legislate that, I think that could be beneficial as long as they aren't overly prescriptive in telling the executive branch how to run it. But excuse me, sorry.
It's okay.
But I think that having a process along those lines would be very having that process is very necessary, and it's one that we should continue.
How much does the rediscovery rate of the 0 days factor into how this process works? Because I know there have been some studies that have been released over the past couple of weeks that look at rediscovery rates and say that they are, larger than we tend to expect. So that presents, a danger that the security community, has to, brace for, and it's something that governments kind of can hold in their back pocket. So kind of talk to me about how you see the rediscovery rate, and if in fact that these studies are true, how does that really factor into how the process works?
Sure. So one of the principles that we also established with the VEP was that if we made a decision to retain a vulnerability and not disclose it, that decision was not permanent and would be revisited on some sort of regular calendar. And you could set that, come back to it in a year, come back to it in 6 months, come back to it in 3 months, depending on the risk that we assessed went with it. And certainly my working assumption was if we can find it, so can somebody else. And so that was actually one of the things that we were always on the lookout for, was did we start to get any indication that somebody else had discovered it? And if that was the case, then that started to weigh very heavily towards disclosure.
Okay.
And so that was a factor that certainly weighed in the decision calculus.
Okay. So with the numbers growing, do you think that any sort of change to being a little bit faster with the disclosure could help? Or is it going to be more at the discretion? Is it still going to be more at the discretion of what the White House or the NSA wants to do?
Well, the default position was always that we were going to disclose. And if you made a decision not to do that, you had to make an affirmative decision to retain. Otherwise, the default position was that we were going to disclose the vulnerability as soon as we could. And I don't think that will, I don't really see that changing. Now, I do think that there are ways that you could speed up the review process and try to make it more streamlined, and that could be beneficial.
I would love to hear your opinion on how you think the shadow brokers has changed this process, because as we've seen, the tools that were leaked by the shadow brokers had to be patched by Microsoft. How does that unknown sort of change the way the process works?
Well, I think it just reinforces the fact that none of these tools, exploits, vulnerabilities are going to stay secret for forever. And whether that was the result of an insider or through a mistake, or however the shadow brokers got their hands on those tools, to the extent they actually are U.S. government tools, it just reinforces the fact that none of those things stay inside, for forever. And you need to be prepared for that to happen. And so, in my view, it puts a premium on paying attention to those sorts of things, making the decision making a review part of the regular process, and then being prepared for, moving very rapidly to address any sort of leaks along those lines. And you need to do that planning ahead of time.
Great. So let's focus a little bit more on the attacks that we've seen in the past couple weeks, specifically the attempts to attack energy companies within the U.S. We're starting to see more and more critical infrastructure being targeted. What can we do differently, and how can these companies adapt to the threats as they continue to grow?
Well, I think that, first of all, the recognition that if you're an owner and operator of a critical infrastructure company, you are going to be a target for someone. And then secondly, the idea that your defense is that your industrial control system or your operational system is air-gapped or not connected to the internet is simply a false one, and that there are ways in that you need to be prepared to defend. And then third, I think that we just need to begin to come to some sort of policy understanding about how we allocate responsibility between the federal government and our private sector, and how we want to allocate those responsibilities and share information, and do that in a much more holistic, seamless way than we're able to right now.
Okay, so on the critical infrastructure front too, there was a push toward the end of the administration to classify voting machines and voting infrastructure under critical infrastructure. And there were a lot of pushback from the states. I'm kind of wondering your perspective on how that process played out and why you think the states have been so, not negative, but why the states have been so hesitant to adopt what DHS has been asking them to do.
So I think at a very fundamental level, we should treat our electoral infrastructure with the same degree of criticality that we treat our power grid, our financial services sector, our healthcare sector. It is extremely important and critical to the functioning of our democracy. So by any definition of critical infrastructure, the voting infrastructure is critical. Now that in and of itself does not tell you then how you actually protect it. Right, and I think what the states were concerned about was federal overreach.
Okay.
This is a power that they guard very jealously, and that from a federalism standpoint, we actually want to be controlled by the states and not have the federal government take a heavy hand there. That's one of the checks and balances and safeguards we have. But it is also probably the case that expecting an individual state, or in many states a county, because a lot of the elections are run at the county level, to take on a nation-state actor is also probably not realistic either. So what I would say is what we need to do is figure out ways to enable federal resources and nationwide resources to be made available to the states through a mechanism that is acceptable to the states, that can raise the level of cybersecurity across our entire country for that electoral infrastructure. But it's definitely a critical problem, and one that we should treat with the same degree of seriousness that we are concerned about the power grid or other parts of our critical infrastructure.
Great. Michael, thanks for taking the time to speak with us today.
Happy to do it. Thank you very much.
For all of our videos, check out our YouTube channel, and for more information, check out cyberscoop.com. I'm Greg Otto. Thanks for watching.